Hi, everybody in Psych 267, Forensic Psychology. Hopefully you have your reading packet now so you can follow along with me when I do these videos. And hopefully you are now going to start with the John Douglas book, Anatomy of Motive. I think you'll enjoy that one, but you'll have to let me know what you think. Anyway, this week we're doing two relatively short chapters instead of one chapter like we did last week and like we will be doing in many of the following weeks, although some of them do have two chapters like we're doing this time. So let's get started. Chapters, or I should say two sections, because that's what it's called, 2 and 3. First one, History of Forensic Psychology. This won't take us long. You can read about it in more detail, but we are going to go through it rather quickly. So, how did all this start that psychology is involved in the legal system? Well, first of all, 10 things to know. It all started in the prehistoric caveman days with trepanning, trepanation. There's so many ways to say this word. I don't know why we can't agree on just one way to say it. But anyway, if you see it on the test, trepanning or trephaning, it is putting a hole in someone's skull. Why on earth would we have done this during prehistoric times? Well, we don't know. But based on things that they drew, we imagine that they were trying to let the evil spirits out of people's heads who were mentally ill and perhaps criminals. Did it work? Well, yes and no. It didn't solve the person's mental illness, but it probably was a punishment and made the person less of a problem, don't you think? Certainly not a cure, that's for sure. So, Hippocrates. Now we're up to the BC era, about 400 BC. Hippocrates was a philosopher, but also a physician. He is the first one to write anything about the belief that mental illness and physical illness were not evil demons, that maybe there was something wrong in your body. He spoke specifically about 4 colored fluids that your body has called body humors. Red being blood, yellow being your urine. He thought there was black bile or humor in your liver and internal organs, and a green one, that's phlegm coming out of your nose. And Hippocrates believed that you could have too much or too little of these colored substances, and that it could be bad or good. By the way, you've probably heard of bloodletting. This all started with Hippocrates. If you were sick or mentally ill, Hippocrates would have said that you had bad blood, and therefore draining your blood and letting your heart pump new blood might just cure you. Obviously, that didn't work too well either, but we have to give him credit for thinking a little bit more like a medical doctor than other people back then. Now, you want to know something that a lot of people don't know? In the winter of 1799, George Washington, our first president, came down with pneumonia, and his doctors did a bloodletting because that's what Hippocrates all those years ago said to do. Well, it killed him. He wasn't going to live much longer anyway, but it made him worse, not better. Anyway, Hippocrates. I just gave you too much information there, I'm afraid. Moving right along. Third thing to know about the history of forensic psychology, witch hunts. It's hard to believe that we labeled people as witches who were mentally ill and committed criminal acts all the way from the late 1200s to the early 1800s. And yes, even in the United States. I have a kind of comedy video, as much as it's not funny, from a Monty Python movie in the module. You might want to look at that real quick. But also, just know that this went on for several hundred years. Hanging people, stoning them, burning them at the stake, tying a boulder around the person and seeing if they float in water like a lake or the ocean. Torture and murder. That's the way we used to handle it. And yes, even here in the United States, you've probably heard of Salem, Massachusetts. They've kind of become famous for that even now. Not that they do it now, but that was their history. Still celebrated and acknowledged to this day. Number 4, the first time that mental illness ever came up in court was Judge Henry de Bracton in England. He formulated the wild beast test. Have you not evolved any more than a wild animal? Well, then you can't be held morally responsible because you lack reasoning. That's what Judge Henry de Bracton said several hundred years ago, back in the 1700s. Insane asylums. This kind of overlaps what Judge Henry de Bracton was doing, because from the 1400s till the early 1900s, we locked up people who were considered insane. They were treated worse than any human should be treated and worse than any animal should be treated. Chained to the walls and beaten and starved. There's a little drawing of a person being chained. Looks like that person has a bed. That wasn't even common back then. One of the most famous ones, insane asylums, Bethlehem, also in England. By the way, this place still exists. It's just a regular hospital now. So, what did they do in Bethlehem? Just like you would think. Chaining people, beating them, starving them. It opened in 1357. For some reason, the townspeople called it Bedlam. So that became a word in English language, meaning craziness. Hey, how's things at your house? Oh, it's Bedlam in here. Craziness. That's what it means. Moving right along. In the late 17 and early 1800s, in France, the Minister of Health, his name was Philippe Pinel. I don't speak French, but I'm sure that's pretty close. Anyway, he developed a more humane approach. He said, we will treat with dignity. By the way, it did not go over very well at first because nobody likes change. They wanted it to be insane asylums, and the people of France were not happy about this, but Pinel got his way, and people did improve, that people were treated better than they used to be. It soon became known as moral therapy, as you will see here, trying to get people to be more moral. If you are truly mentally ill, you have other problems too. I'm not saying that morals aren't important, they are, but that is just part of it, we now know. And that's what he thought people needed. Cattell, 1895. Now we're getting a little more modern, aren't we? He did some of the earliest research on psychology in court-related testimony. He did this with his students, trying to find accuracies and inaccuracies. So we give Cattell credit for starting the whole idea of psychology in the courtroom. But 1908, Hugo Munsterberg, who is number 8 on this list, he published a book on the witness stand, advocating for psychologists to be able to testify in court, because we do have a special skill set and set of knowledge that can be used in legal cases. Number 9, it didn't start until the 1920s that psychologists could testify in court, and 1940, the court case People versus Hawthorne ruled that you don't have to be a medical doctor to be an expert witness. A psychologist can be one too. Well, guess what? Your teacher, me, your professor, I do that. I testify in court as a licensed psychologist. And number 10, the landmark Supreme Court case, 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, ruled integration instead of segregation. I would highly recommend that you watch the little video clip that I have of Ruby Bridges, who was one of the first children to go to a white school as a black kid. And this was because of Brown versus the Board of Education. Dr. Kenneth Clark, a psychologist, did the research to prove that it is not harmful for black and white kids to be educated together. It used to be thought that it was. That was segregation. What we have now is integration. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0. That's unusual even these days. And it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was called separate but equal. Now, I think we would all agree that it wasn't equal for Black people and other minorities. So I would highly recommend you watch that very short YouTube video. And there's Dr. Kenneth Clark. And look at that, the Supreme Court decision back in the old school days of typewriters. Moving right along. Section 3, Diagnosis and Assessment in Forensic Cases. Here's what you need to know. Psychologists can do something that no other profession can do. Assess people with an evaluation. Sure, a psychiatrist and a medical doctor can give you a diagnosis and medicine and label you, but not with all the testing that psychologists are trained to do. So, psychological evaluations as part of an assessment, a written report, that is what I have done thousands of times for the court system. Forensic psychology at its finest. So first of all, record reviews. I get as many records as I can so I can learn about the person that I'm evaluating who is accused of committing a crime. Record reviews. Now, too bad we're not getting to see each other in person, because if we did, you would see that I am probably a lot older than you. But you know what? There's probably more records out there on you. This is a relatively new thing, that everything is put into a record and stored somewhere online or on a server. That didn't used to exist years ago, but it sure does now. So the more records we can get, the more accurate the evaluation can be. Clinical interviews. Interviews can be structured where you ask very exact, specific questions, or unstructured, where you just have a conversation with a person. Structured is nice because I get very exact answers to my very exact questions. But unstructured can be good too, because what if the person wants to tell me something that's not part of a question? Or what if my million questions in a row, I'm exaggerating, makes them uncomfortable? Maybe they just want to have a conversation. So there's some advantages to being structured, some advantages to being unstructured. I would recommend a little of both. It's the best way to do an interview, in my opinion. Now, wouldn't you agree you don't have to be highly trained to read records or do an interview? I would, but it's the testing that you learn in your PhD program or doctoral level program to be a psychologist. Psychological testing. So again, I'm going to hit the highlights here. First of all, reliability versus validity. Now, this is kind of interesting because I'm recording this in COVID times. Reliability. If you were tested and it told you what they got as results on your COVID test, and you took it 3 times in a row in 20 minutes, either the spit test or shoving that Q-tip-like thing up your nose. Oh my goodness, that's so uncomfortable. I've been through that. Anyway, wouldn't you hope it would get the same result? That's reliability. But the other question is it valid? Is it really giving you the result that is accurate? So, a bathroom scale, if it says the same result over and over again or something pretty darn close, it's reliable. But is that really your weight? Valid. Well, same thing with an IQ test or a measure of depression or anxiety or schizophrenia. You want it to be reliable. If nothing has changed, it should give you the same result. And you want it to be valid, giving you an accurate result, something that is true. Now, what are these personality tests? We're going to talk about 2 broad categories: objective, also known as self-report, and projective. Objective is kind of a silly word. You're supposed to be objective about yourself? How is that possible? So I like self-report. You try to report about yourself as, well, objectively as possible, accurately as possible. The most widely known one and the most widely used, the MMPI-2. The Minnesota multi-axle, personality inventory. I'm getting ahead of myself. MMPI-2. Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. I should not read while I talk. I get myself all mixed up. Anyway, just know MMPI-2. It has clinical scales. Are you schizophrenic, anxious, depressed, things like that? And validity scales. Is it even valid? And if it's not valid or accurate, maybe you're faking good. Maybe you're faking bad and you want to look mentally ill. Or maybe you just lie a lot. Well, those are all validity scales that will measure how valid it is. Projective. This is psychodynamic, Freudian. Your unconscious is coming out, according to people who use projective tests. There are two that I want you to know, even though there are many more, just like there's many more objective tests than we talked about. The Rorschach, ink blots. What do you see in the ink blot? Well, there's no right answer. Your unconscious will come out. And the TAT, Thematic Apperception Test. There's no right answer. It's your unconscious that will come out, according to psychodynamic psychologists. So look at that. Here's one of each. Let's go backwards. The first one is the TAT. What on earth is going on there? Is that her grandmother? Is it like Snow White and the Evil Witch? Is it, oh, I don't know, maybe it's her when she gets old? Whatever you see is what's really happening. And what about the one on the right side of the page? Do you see two wolves in opposite directions? Do you see a mask? Do you see a bat or a butterfly? Well, whatever you see is your perception, and unconsciously, that is the way you see things. By the way, the Rorschach was invented when Herman Rorschach was looking at clouds with his daughter in the sky, and she could see things like a princess or a pumpkin that he couldn't see in the cloud formations, and he's like, wow, this is her unconscious coming out. And that's how he developed the idea for the test. Whereas the TAT was invented much later in the mid-1900s, but those animated pictures are supposed to say something about your unconscious. Intelligence testing, 1904 in France. Didn't we just talk about France? I think we did. Alfred Binet came up with this. Look at that little boy. He doesn't look too happy to be there, does he? Binet has his arm around him. Well, anyway, Binet came up with an idea to test your mental age divided by your real age, chronological age. That would be a fraction or a decimal, times 100 is your IQ. So here's the thing to know. This is a reliable test. If you took it when you're 5 and when you're 25, it would probably be pretty similar because we're only comparing you to people your own age. So if you were above average as a little kid, you probably still are to this day, unless maybe you got whacked in the head and brain damage or, something happened that made you a lot smarter. For most of us, we remain pretty consistent or reliable. The problem with IQ tests is, can you really say that it's valid? What if the person struggles with the language the test is being given in? Or what if the person is having a bad day or has a headache or is just uncooperative? Most importantly, what if the person is from another culture and they don't know about the things that you're asking about? So it's validity that's more in question than reliability. By the way, one more thing. It has verbal and performance measures. See that on the top right here? Verbal meaning I would ask you questions and you would tell me the answer. So part of your IQ is your knowledge base. That is the part that's more culturally biased because maybe you haven't even heard of the things I'm asking you about, but you still could be smart. Whereas performance measures have you do things like puzzles and block designs and mazes and stuff like that. That has a little less to do with a person's culture than the verbal part. Now, diagnosis. Psychologists and psychiatrists and all kinds of mental health professionals use this book right here, the DSM-5. About every 20 years, there's a new edition. Around Thanksgiving in 2013 is the newest edition. The DSM-5, before that was the 4 and the 3 and the 2. About every 20 years or so, they come up with a new one. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That is how we diagnose people. So, some of the disorders that maybe you've heard of don't exist anymore, or they were renamed. We don't have Asperger's anymore. It's now high-functioning autism. Stuttering is now a communication fluency disorder. There's new ones maybe that you haven't heard of yet, like disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. That applies to kids that throw emotional fits, and hoarding disorder, and sexual internet addiction. Wow. Oh, look at that one, the last one. Good to end on a controversy. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder used to be known as PMS in women. Well, now that is one where you can diagnose yourself if you feel like that's something you have and you're female and it's interfering with your mental health. Well, look at that. The next section is section 4, but that is on the next video. So that's it for now. Take care, and don't forget to be reading the Douglas book, too.